Moses stood at the edge of the promised land, gazing into a future he would never see. The man who had led Israel out of slavery, who had faced Pharaoh and split the Red Sea, was forbidden from entering. Most assume it was Moses' anger that kept him out, that his temper with the people cost him everything. But the truth cuts far deeper.
The people were thirsty.
Again, after all God had done, they complained against Moses. And Moses, burdened and weary, went to God for help. God's answer was clear. Speak to the rock, and water will come out. Simple, direct, a word, not a strike. But Moses didn't speak to the rock. He struck it, twice. And the water came. The miracle happened just as God promised.
The people got what they needed.
So what exactly went wrong?
The problem was never the water.
The problem was how Moses represented God. He struck the rock the way Pharaoh would have, with force, with impatience, without trust in God's holiness.
It was a subtle thing.
A small shift in method. But God doesn't judge by what's hidden. He judges by what our actions reveal.
Back at Sinai,
Striking the rock had been the right command. God told Moses to strike, and he struck. But now, 40 years later, God said, "Speak." The method mattered because the rock pointed to something greater. The rock in the wilderness was a shadow of Christ, struck once for all, so that we would never have to strike again. When Moses struck instead of spoke, he misunderstood what God was revealing.
God's correction was firm.
Moses would not enter the land. But notice what God didn't do. He didn't reject Moses. He corrected him. There's a difference. In the very next chapter, God says, "Moses, my servant." Not Moses the failure, not Moses you blew it. He was still called God's servant. One sin, one moment of misplaced trust, didn't erase everything God had done through Moses. It didn't undo the miracles. It didn't cancel his legacy. God saw Moses' heart. He knew the weariness behind the anger, the decades of carrying a complaining people. And he saw the pattern, that Moses had come to rely on his own strength instead of God's voice.
We do this too, don't we?
We get tired, and we solve problems the way the world does, with impatience, with force, instead of trusting that God's way is higher. Moses was corrected, not discarded. And so are we. God's discipline is not his rejection, it's his love, shaping us to reflect him more clearly. One failure doesn't erase a lifetime of obedience. Moses still went up on the mountain. Moses still saw the glory of God. Moses still died in intimate fellowship with his Father. The story of Moses is not a story of defeat. It's a story of refinement. God used one failure to teach a lesson that would echo through eternity. And today, God is still teaching us. He's still shaping our lives to reveal who he is, not just to us, but to everyone watching. So if you failed, hear this. God is not finished with you. He corrects those he loves. And he uses imperfect people to display his perfect grace. This moment in Moses' life doesn't just come from one scene. It unfolds across the wilderness journey in the book of Numbers and is remembered again in Deuteronomy. And that matters, because this wasn't just a message, it was a message. Moses didn't lose the promised land because God was harsh. He lost it because what we do under pressure reveals what we truly believe about God. And that's where this story becomes personal, because you may not be standing in a desert, but you are in moments where pressure is high, where people are watching, and where your response tells a story. A story about trust, a story about obedience, a story about who God really is. And sometimes the result might still look successful on the outside, but God is looking deeper, at the heart, at the representation, at what your life is saying about him.
Moses' story unfolds in the wilderness, written through the journey in Numbers and remembered again in Deuteronomy, and it reveals something deeper than a mistake. Because in the moments when pressure rises, when people are watching, your response tells a story about what you believe, a story about who God is, and sometimes, even when everything looks right on the outside, God is looking at something deeper. So subscribe, because these stories aren't just history. They might be revealing something in your life right now you don't want to miss.